On the surface, Gen Z looks just like any other generation before them, sort of. But beneath their external appearances are some of the most extreme ideologies the world has ever seen. Take a look at this guy. He goes by the name Clavicular online. Seems like a normal dude, right? But if you watch even 30 seconds of one of his videos, he will start using words that, to maybe 80% of people who speak English, seem completely made up.
So we take a look and we've got a lot of rosacea, just showing you a basic way to improve by 1 to 2 PSL. Because these two things, these two softmaxes can go a long way. With the lack of facial angularity, it's causing me to have an overly wide perceived facial width to height ratio.
Clavicular is part of a group of people called looksmaxers who first spawned on internet forums. Looksmaxers are obsessed with doing anything and everything they can to maximize what they call their PSL and SMV, their personal look scale and sexual market value, respectively. They believe that the only thing that determines basically all areas of success in your life is your looks, and to not obsess over your looks is doing yourself a massive disservice.
Do you value hard work at all?
No, absolutely not. I value efficient work, I value smart work. Hard work is a ridiculous concept.
In order to optimize his looks maxing, Clavicular has been injecting testosterone since the age of 14, and he plans on flying to Turkey soon for a double jaw surgery. According to online sources, he's only 19 years old. And yet he has adopted what I think most people would consider a very radicalized view of the world. Subgroups of different extremist ideologies like looks maxing are not uncommon these days. Now we have groypers, a term used to identify followers or fans of white nationalist and live streamer Nick Fuentes. On the left side we have Antifa or anarcho-communists, or tankies glorifying authoritarian communist regimes. We have black pillars holding similar beliefs to looks maxers in regards to the fact that the only thing that matters is looks, while extending their beliefs outside of the looks realm to an all-encompassing doomeristic view of the world. We have hyper-masculine traditionalists and tradwives who think we should repeal the 19th Amendment, and hyper-feminists who think men are the source of all evil. When you scroll through the trenches of social media, Reddit, or underground internet forums, your first instinct might be to ask, how could anyone seriously think like this? But if you understood the world much of Gen Z inhabits, and how that world compares to the history of past generations of radicalized youth, this would not surprise you at all. So today, I want to talk a little bit about that history. I want to explain to you why the youth have always radicalized during moments like these, how that radicalization has adapted to the internet era, and offer a way toward maybe, just maybe, not necessarily compassion, but at the very least understanding. And then we can talk about what it would actually take to pull ourselves out of this. In order to understand Gen Z's radicalization, we need to look at its contributing factors. It's not enough to just throw up our hands and say, wow, these people are so out of touch and stupid, as true as that might seem in some cases. We need to ask, what kind of world produces young people who think this way? Switching the framing like that can provide us with a perspective that might help cool our anger towards these groups' harmful or hateful beliefs, while allowing us to observe historical trends that answer the question I just posed. Historically, young people are more prone to radicalization when certain conditions are met, and the conditions I want to focus on in this video are economic instability and declining optimism, adults and institutions failing to provide stable meaning and a sense of generational betrayal, and massive technological shifts. And if it isn't obvious to you already, all of these kind of work in tandem. One affects the other, and so forth and so forth. So let's go over the first point, economic instability and declining optimism, using a time where mass radicalization of the youth reached a somewhat similar popularity as it has today, post-World War I Germany. Germany came out of the war defeated and humiliated, sending the economy into full hyperinflation. By 1923, the monthly inflation rate peaked around 29,500%, meaning prices were doubling every few days. One US dollar, which cost 50 marks in 1920, was suddenly worth 4.2 trillion marks by November 1923. Middle-class savings, pensions, and long-term wages were basically erased, and if you're young people watching your parents' finances vanish overnight, the message is pretty clear. The system doesn't work, and the adults in charge have no idea what they're doing. Hyperinflation got tamed by 1924, but the damage to trust was done. Then, the Great Depression hit. Industrial output fell by roughly 30%, and by 1932, around 6.1 million Germans were unemployed, about 1/3 of the working-age population. Historians writing about this period talk about a, quote, lost generation of jobless youth whose entire entry into adult life was barricaded. Being young in 1930s Germany often meant no job, no prospects, and no clear place in society. Does that sound familiar? Now let's talk about how this funneled young people into extremist thinking. In this context, radical political groups became one of the only places offering a story that made sense out of the chaos and a path to feeling useful and important. On the far right, the Nazi Party and its orbit leaned hard into youth recruitment. After the crash, Nazi electoral support exploded from about 2% of the vote in 1928 to 38% by mid-1932, making them the largest party in the Reichstag. Paramilitary groups like the SA and earlier Freikorps units, often made up of men in their 20s, gave disoriented young guys uniforms, camaraderie, and a sense of political purpose. But the clearest example of this youth funnel is the Hitler Youth. Membership was relatively modest at the end of 1932, about 108,000 boys. But after the Nazis took power and started suppressing rival youth organizations, membership skyrocketed to 2.3 million by 1933 and around 3.6 million by 1934, and kept climbing in the later 1930s. It's important to note that people don't necessarily adopt extremist racist ideologies simply because of economic instability, but if there's some part of that embedded already within the culture, and then a strong enough, confident enough political leader produces enough propaganda to convince you that your problems will be solved if you attach yourself to these racist ideologies, that's when it really starts to sprout. On the far left, there was somewhat of a similar story. The Young Communist League of Germany, the youth wing of the Communist Party, grew into a dedicated militant organization whose membership peaked in the tens of thousands by the last years of the Weimar Republic. So you have one set of youth channeling their anger into nationalist extremism and racial hierarchy, while another channeled it into revolutionary extremism and class war. But both sides are reacting to a structural reality where their future was stripped away from them, and in that reality, extremist organizations promise three things that normal institutions can no longer promise, which is certainty, belonging, and a future. Without thinking too hard, you can clearly see how much of this mirrors the material conditions and cultural narratives happening in the West today. The unemployment rate for Americans between 20 and 24 just hit a 10-year high, excluding the pandemic. And for the first time in the last 40 years or so, the unemployment rate for recent college graduates aged 22 to 27 is higher than the unemployment rate for all workers. While renting prices have cooled down significantly, the general cost of living has not. Any Gen Zer can tell you how unaffordable daily life feels now, even with an average job. And of course, the rising cost of education throws them into thousands of dollars of debt before they can even get started. In a system like this, it's no wonder that young people are more susceptible to latching on to extremist ideas, because those ideas, unlike the solutions proposed by people who are more nuanced and sit in the middle of the political spectrum, are vivid and establish a clear enemy, which to them at least is much better than having no purpose at all. But I want to expand upon that point a bit further after going into the next condition which usually leads to radicalization in a society: adults and institutions failing to provide stable meaning and a sense of generational betrayal. But first, I've been talking extensively on this channel about being chronically offline, and the importance of that is really going to be highlighted in the second half of this video. But one thing that's really helped me with that is e-ink devices, and that's why I'm happy to introduce today's sponsor, the Viwoods AI paper reader. If you aren't familiar, this is an e-ink device that uses a screen called Carta 1300 with a 300 pixels per inch display that manipulates tiny black and white particles. It is the perfect blend between digital and analog and has helped a ton with reducing my doom scrolling addiction. I actually owned a larger e-ink device before, but Viwoods' device is the size of a phone and I can take it anywhere I go, and runs on the Android 16 operating system. It's extremely well designed and very compact. Now, instead of pulling out my phone during my free time, I can open EPUBs and PDFs of books I've loaded onto the device and read without having to lug anything heavy around. While you're reading, you can also tap a button on the side to use AI to assist you if there's anything complex you need help understanding in your books. Then you can save the answer into your knowledge base stored on the device, so you have a concise and easy way to search for all the lessons and important plot points in your readings. On top of that, if you wanted this device to replace your phone, it absolutely could, since it runs on Android, so you can take calls and send messages too. And although the screen does have a backlight you can use if you're in a dark environment, if you turn the brightness all the way down, it doesn't produce any blue light like phones do, so it won't cause any eye strain or interfere with your sleep. So if you're interested in tackling your doom scrolling addiction and going more analog, you can click the first link in the description and try it out, and hopefully it will replace some or most of your phone usage. Before the internet became the youth's primary source of information, most of your sense of how the world works came from a few big pillars: your family, school, maybe a church or religious community, and whatever image of the country you got from news, movies, and politics. If they're functioning well, they offer some kind of answer to questions like, what matters? Who can I trust? And is the future worth working toward? It's common for the youth to disagree or even rebel against the most common answers to these questions, but they still form a stable backdrop. However, when these institutions start to feel hollow or hypocritical, that backdrop collapses. To see how this played out in the real world and relate it back to today, we can look at the late 1960s and early 1970s in the US and Western Europe. In the early 1960s, most Americans still believed the federal government was basically trustworthy. In 1964, about 77% of Americans said they trusted Washington to do what is right just about always or most of the time. Within a decade, after the escalation of the Vietnam War, civil rights clashes, urban riots, and the Watergate scandal, that number had dropped to 36%, and by the end of the 1970s, it was around 25%. In other words, the default assumption went from the people in charge are trying, even if they mess up, to they're probably lying. At the same time, the Vietnam War made that loss of trust feel brutally personal, especially for young people. Between 1964 and 1973, the US military drafted about 2.2 million men out of an eligible pool of 27 million. The people deciding on the war were older, and the people forced to fight in it were overwhelmingly 18 to 26. That age gap is the emotional core of generational betrayal. The older people make these catastrophic decisions, and the younger bodies have to absorb the consequences. Then there's events like what happened at Kent State. On May 4th, 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on students protesting the war at Kent State University in Ohio, killing 4 and wounding 9 more. The shootings triggered a nationwide student strike that shut down hundreds of colleges and universities. Think about what that does to you as a young person watching that unfold. The institutions are basically saying that they would rather shoot you than listen to you, and whatever moral authority those institutions held evaporates. A similar pattern played out in France during May 1968. Student protests against rigid universities led to police crackdowns and street battles in Paris, and within weeks around 10 million workers joined a general strike, which was the largest in French history. The economy hadn't collapsed like Weimar Germany's, but a whole generation felt locked out by rigid institutions and a political class that refused to make room for them. In both cases, you see the same pattern. Institutions lose legitimacy, younger generations feel increasingly sacrificed or silenced, and more radical movements step in with a satisfying narrative. They say you're not crazy, you're right to feel betrayed, here's who did this to you, and here's how we fight back. Talking about this with a bit of nuance though, and I'm going to highlight this again in the later portion of the video, I do think some radical movements are necessary. Going on protest for students getting shot, going on this nationwide meltdown, it's sometimes necessary in order to enact the change that you need. But it is happening in a different sort of flavor here, and that's not necessarily the type of radical movements that I have been trying to criticize throughout this video and that I'm going to continue trying to criticize. These sorts of problems have only been highlighted and exacerbated to the nth degree in modern society. Using our next condition I'm going to go over, the technological shifts we've received over the past couple decades, every corrupt politician or scandal has been dissected and exposed, leaving little to no room for manipulation. And when you couple that with an increasingly unstable and unpredictable environment, it's no wonder why the youth feels like they were betrayed and the future that they prepared for never came. But by far, what is probably the biggest contributor to radicalization of all types that has undoubtedly affected all of these other conditions is the rise of the internet and smartphones. The globalization of information allowed us to educate ourselves on so much, but it also made it remarkably easier to fall into echo chambers of misinformation and extremist thinking to help us explain why we feel so lost, empty, hopeless, and displaced. It is not just politicians or people in power who can do the manipulating now. Anyone with enough confidence and perceived authority can lean into your confirmation bias, convincing you that your struggles are due to some singular life flaw or a certain group of people, when the reality is far more complex. Looksmaxing is one of those examples. Often looksmaxers align their beliefs highly with the black pill ideology. This is a sphere on the internet who believe that without good looks, you have zero chance of attracting somebody, getting a good job, or achieving basically any amount of success. But the foundations of society set them up for this kind of thinking. Before someone even considers themselves a black pillar, they're usually someone who's having more difficulty with women than they ever would have in previous generations, largely because the dating market has skewed in ways shaped by technology and a lack of stable opportunities. So what do? They go searching for answers online. Confirmation bias pushes them to focus only on what already feels true, which might be the belief that everything comes down to their looks. They start consuming black pill content in a viscerally emotional state, and the experiences within that community mirror their own. Slowly, they seep deeper and deeper into that rabbit hole, and that ideology seeps into everything they do. I can only imagine some version of this happened to that clavicular guy I mentioned at the beginning. Because let's be honest here, if technology and social media didn't push us to focus on the more superficial aspects of humanity, if the economy was stable and people had a fairly easy time getting a job and a partner, and it wasn't revealed that basically all institutions are lying to us and there's little meaning to extract from any of this, do you think the thought of I need to become a Chad Looksmaxer would have even crossed this guy's mind? Absolutely not. But the conditions of society today create the perfect concoction to produce more radicalized young people because radicalization gives them something to grasp in a world that feels increasingly nebulous. It also gives them a sense of identity, which is unbelievably important when you're young and something that social media and institutions have broke. And that's another reason why this iteration of society feels so devoid of hope and purpose, even if there might be. At least in the past, if you were going through some shit, you would at least have that friend group or some sort of community like a religious organization that you could fall back to that hold the same beliefs as you. But the internet, in all of its individualized, hyperbolized sections, divides humans into extremely specific, unique subcategories that separate you from everyone else in a way that we have never seen before. When we gained access to any and all information, it gave us the ability to shape our beliefs into something uniquely our own. But the consequence was that agreeableness, even when it meant conforming to a group you didn't fully align with, began to erode. The amount of identity subgroups on the internet is insane now. There's gooners, doomer zoomers, e-girls, femcels, sigma males, neo-trad wives, based nationalists, anarcho-primitivists. The list is endless. You might not trust your government, your school, or your parents, but you can trust those guys in your Discord server or subreddit who can understand all the things that you're going through that nobody else can. Or you can trust the creator who's telling you exactly why you're struggling and exactly who's to blame. And there's also something a bit more insidious going on with the internet and the feedback loop it provides that I don't think enough people really understand or are talking about. I brought this article up in my last video, but it is simply too important to not bring it up again. This National Geographic article shows how social media keeps you in a constantly deregulated, traumatized state. In the article, there was a study measuring acute stress after viewing the pictures of the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, and they found that people who viewed more violent imagery were more likely to report post-traumatic stress symptoms like nightmares, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness 6 months later. But this is the insane part. Individuals who consumed over 6 hours of media per day reported more acute psychological symptoms like unwanted dreams, difficulty sleeping, and intrusive memories than those who were actually at the bombing. So think about how often this happens nowadays, now that we have access to all of the world's tragedies that are thrust down our throat at all times on social media. You have millions of young Americans stuck in an emotional state that is similar, if not worse, to trauma survivors, who then go out into the real world in that emotional state, who then affect the world in that emotional state due to how they engage with it. Like, it's no fucking wonder why Gen Z is so radicalized, because when you're in such an emotionally dysregulated state all the time, the logic centers of the brain turn off. You stop seeking the nuance, you stop trying to find objective truth, and you simply just grasp onto whatever makes sense in that moment, whatever's the most extreme, and whatever attaches to your emotions the most and makes you feel the most pleasurable in that moment. And in that moment, it's gonna be some sort of radical thinking. So let's try to distill everything that has led to Gen Z's radicalization in a few sentences. They live in a time of increasing debt, unemployment, and economic uncertainty. The traditional forms of meaning, whether through religion or community in real life, have kind of dissolved. There's a growing distrust in institutions to set things right, and an equally growing divide between a generation that came up in a steadier world and one raised inside an ever-changing, ever-complex hyper-reality. And as a result, to try to form any semblance of belonging, meaning, or revolt, Gen Z is more prone to radicalize themselves into loads of different subgroups. Do you really think I'm just gonna leave this video on that note? Absolutely not. I do not believe in raising awareness to problems without posing solutions. I don't know much. Maybe that's probably obvious to you by now, but here's what I do know. What I told you. We have been in a similar situation before. The youth have fought to restore meaning and to create a less bleak future through hope. The constantly dysregulated states we find ourselves in due to the atrocities portrayed on social media makes it much harder for most people to actually enact the changes they want to see in the real world. But I promise you, you have more agency over your life than you think, and you will realize it when you fight against these primal urges to seek out negative information and hopelessness on this thing. I thought for a while about what message I wanted to leave you with, and I think this is it. In order to escape the radicalization rabbit hole you might find yourselves in, you need to escape or be inspired through art. And before you get all mad at me, like what the hell is this guy even talking about, let me tell you a story about two people during World War I who instilled optimism back into the youth. In 1916, Switzerland was neutral but surrounded by the chaos of war. Optimism for the future was hard to come by, and people needed a place to cope with reality's relentless bad news. Inspired by the artists, writers, and intellectuals that fled there, Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings opened what they called the Cabaret Voltaire in 1916. The cabaret staged absurd performances, including spoken word, dance, and music. Though some of these performances were directly tied to the war, much of the entertainment was experimental, allowing the audience to, if only for a moment, escape the raging conflict. This used to be the young people's best way of escaping from the atrocities of life that they couldn't make a direct impact on in the moment. They immersed themselves in art, gathering together in groups that, in most cases I would say, didn't discriminate and were very welcoming. When people came out of that viewing experience, out of engaging with art, suddenly they were instilled with a bit of hope. And though the idea of a better future might have seemed far away, that little sense of hope reverberated throughout their actions. If we compare that to how we cope today, the difference is night and day. Our forms of escapism don't leave us more refreshed and inspired to take on the world when we return to it. They only leave us more doomeristic and hopeless. If we really want to start feeling like things will get better, which will in turn allow us to do the actions that will actually make life better for us in the future, we need to engage with art meaningfully like we used to. Art is where we go to make sense of the world. It's where connections are made and stories take place that ignite inspiration and optimism within us. A good book, a good movie, a good painting, a good piece of craftsmanship. This is where we see someone's tireless process materialized that some part of us can relate to. And when we see and we're surrounded by people who have the same feelings we have, who overcame those feelings and overcame that struggle through art, we start to think to ourselves, maybe that's possible for me too. Maybe I can start to shift things into a positive state. When you detach yourself from the phone, when you immerse yourself in a great piece of fiction, or you paint, or you journal, or you write, or you build some DIY project while you're still working through your emotions, that's when you start to realize there is a future that looks better, and it is a future I can contribute to. As soon as you feel yourself getting emotional and wanting to turn to this rectangle to shut your brain off, stop. Let your thoughts breathe. Think about how you're trying to blame some sort of average person or some group of people for what's going on in the world and how you want to become radicalized and how your emotions are starting to fill up. Sit with those emotions, as awful as they might feel, and move through them through some sort of art form or through some sort of healthy escapism like I outlined in this video. Just realize how every human at the end of the day just wants to feel fulfilled, like their actions mean something in the world. And if someone is super radicalized, you now understand why the world would push them to that sort of thinking. And you don't necessarily have to give that type of person sympathy, but at the very least you can have that sort of understanding and perhaps push them to not be as radicalized in their thinking through healthy, engaging conversations, healthy discourse, and healthy disagreements that could help push us towards a better world where we understand, yeah, we're pretty fucking different, but we're also pretty fucking alike, and everyone kind of just wants the same thing, and there's probably a better way to do all of this. And that's a world where we can actually start tackling the root issues of economic instability, institutions failing, and a lack of meaning, instead of blaming it on a certain race or because you don't have a high enough sexual market value. I would love to hear how you inject more optimism into this world in the comments below. Let's start a positive chain just to get the more positive stuff flowing so people actually feel influenced to get off their phones or get off whatever they're watching this on right now and go engage with the real world and smile at people and just think, well, we're going to fucking make it through this because we've been in a similar situation before and we'll get through it again. And that is it. That is it. I'm not going to tell you to watch another video. Go enjoy life.